Hi, this is Dr. Kate Isaac, and I'm here to give you an introduction to our second module. Before we begin discussion of this module's topic, individual radicalization, I want to remind you where we are in our course and what we've covered already, as well as what we still have to discuss. We used Module 1 to provide a broad overview of our work in terrorism studies and to explain a set of global trends and patterns in terrorism we've discovered through our work with the Global Terrorism Database. We're now going to begin a unit that looks at the concept of radicalization and some of the things our researchers have figured out about what drives individuals to participate in terrorism. This will set us up for our modules on terrorist group dynamics and terrorist operations, because it allows us to start by thinking about what brings individuals to terrorist groups in the first place. We can talk about the motivations and the drivers behind individuals' choices to join terrorist groups and to embrace violence in service of a cause. We can then take those revelations with us when we go on to look at the ways in which groups form, interact, make decisions, and carry out operations to help us understand them better. Then, of course, this unit should be particularly helpful when we reach our capstone unit on Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda module will take a detailed look at how this one particular group formed, and insights on the processes that drive individuals to choose terrorism will be useful for following the discussion of the group's development and evolution. We'll also hear discussion of several research findings related to Al-Qaeda members and members of groups linked to Al-Qaeda in this module on radicalization. In this module, we'll present to you a series of ideas scholars have developed about the ways people become interested in and engaged in terrorism, as well as indicators that suggest someone may be more likely to engage in terrorism. In our first video, Mr. Braniff will explain the concept of radicalization, the fact that we're working here to understand a very specific process or set of processes in this group of lectures, the ways in which an individual comes to accept that violence is necessary to advance an ideological goal. In our second video for this module, Mr. Braniff will more specifically attend to the term ideology. He'll define an extremist ideology as a specific belief system that interprets grievances, assigns blame for them, provides a vision of a new and improved world for the individual, and tells that individual what he or she needs to do in order to get there. He'll talk about some common ideologies we see in the analysis of terrorism, looking at separatist, ethno-nationalist, and racist ideologies. With that foundation laid, I'd like to recommend that you proceed to one of our optional readings as your next step in this module. Dr. Clark Macaulay, START investigator and professor of psychology at Bryn Mawr College, has a very short 2-page research brief in the optional reading section where he outlined, 6 years ago now, the beginnings of his work on identifying specific pathways to radicalization. He's recently published a more extensive treatment of the topic in the award-winning monograph, Friction: How Radicalization Happens to Them and Us. His short piece available here outlines a series of 12 mechanisms of radicalizations. These mechanisms, things like personal victimization, when an individual feels attacked or victimized, or political grievance, when an individual feels that political trends are hurting or threatening a group, show us a series of paths that bring an individual not involved in terrorism into the use of violence to support a cause. Dr. Macaulay's research brief is a nice introduction to this idea of radicalization mechanisms, and you'll hear a lot about different such pathways or drivers that lead individuals to terrorism in this module, as well as indicators that make an individual potentially more likely than other individuals to engage in terrorism. For instance, you'll hear quite a bit about grievances in this module, which we can define most simply as a real or imagined wrong or other cause of complaint or protest. It often refers to a feeling of unfair treatment in some capacity. Mr. Braniff will talk quite a bit about grievance as a major component of or pathway to radicalization. He explains grievance as something that leads an individual to what he calls a cognitive opening, which makes room in an individual's mind for him or her to begin considering and perhaps accept an extremist ideology. Dr. Macaulay also writes about grievances, both personal and political, and Dr. Aryeh Kruglanski introduces an important related psychological concept, the quest for personal significance, which he'll describe as an individual's motivation to matter, to have status or prestige. Dr. Kruglanski will talk about the quest for significance as a major driver or pathway towards radicalization, and he'll tell us that the quest for significance is typically activated by a loss of significance, a grievance such as a divorce or health problem. We'll hear about lots of other mechanisms or drivers as well. Dr. Macaulay, Mr. Braniff, and Dr. Gary Lafree will all talk about family and social ties to individuals who are already radicalized as important mechanisms of radicalization, for instance. Dr. Lafree will also talk about prior histories of crime or violence. He'll note mental health concerns in the case of lone actor terrorists in particular. He'll talk about changes in performance and social standing. You can also read about some preliminary findings on the influence of religion and specific demographics in one of our optional readings, a one-page fact sheet on the database that Dr. Lafree will discuss in this model, the Profiles of Radicalization in the United States dataset. This module will provide a lot of theory, suppositions or systems of ideas intended to explain something, in this case, the phenomenon of an individual's radicalization to terrorism. But you also hear about a number of teaching cases in this module. Mr. Braniff will discuss the Tsarnaev brothers and the Boston Marathon bombing. He'll also talk a little bit about the Islamic State in the Levant, or ISIL. Dr. Lafree will talk extensively about lone actor terrorism and touch on examples of far-right lone actor incidents, including the 1992 siege at Ruby Ridge. Dr. Kurlansky will talk extensively about the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, and he'll also touch on some research he's done on Al-Qaeda, Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, and Moroccan immigrants in Spain. Dr. Juliet Bird will talk a little bit about potential for radicalization among Afghan soldiers during NATO operations. Finally, I just want to note that there will be an underlying thread in this week's modules of our speakers and writers addressing the question of countering radicalization. Mr. Braniff will introduce the related concepts of de-radicalization, counter-radicalization, disengagement, and countering violent extremism. He'll also present a model for approaching the countering of radicalization on 4 distinct levels. Dr. Bird will discuss research NATO has conducted and practices NATO has implemented to deter radicalization when NATO forces work alongside personnel from other nations in military theaters of operations. And I want to direct you quickly to an interesting optional reading from Dr. Stephen Wine, a professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois, Chicago, who presents a model of radicalization he has developed through research with Somali youths in Minnesota, as well as a model for preventing youth radicalization and strengthening communities. In all, this module should cover a wide swath of research on what drives individuals to participate in terrorism, and it should set up some interesting discussion in the forums, where we hope you'll engage a little on the ideas surrounding radicalization and ideology. Best of luck in this module, and I'll talk with you again at the beginning of the Terrorist Group Dynamics section of the course.